what's happened. We have either a man-made or a natural disaster. I think we've all seen this movie before. People initially in their bunkers or in their basements trying to survive, and they're trying to communicate with their short-range family radios or maybe some police radios they've obtained. And on TV it looks like they can communicate magically for hundreds of miles using these handheld radios. Well, the reality is once you lose the internet and all power, those radios are going to be limited to just a few hundred feet in the case of these family radios, or maybe a mile or two for the police walkie-talkies. And you're going to want to get out. You're going to want to find out if somebody else is out there. So if you watch the movies, you'll see guys and they're trying to use some old ham radio, and is anybody out there? Is anybody out there? And it's really a great theme. We see all kinds of radios being used in these movies. We see you know, the old ICOMs, the old Yaesu 101s, of course, some of the old Heathkits and Collins type gear. And even military equipment creeps into a lot of these. And sometimes it's period accurate and sometimes it's not. So in this video we're going to pretend that we are looking for such a radio so we can communicate to the outside world. And I think if you know some former amateur radio operators or CBers, that they're going to have some radio squirreled away in their garage or in their attic, and they're going to dig that radio out for you. So here we go. Here's one such box found in an attic. This box, the amateur, or the former amateur, assures me has not been opened for over 25 years. And inside is a single sideband high-frequency transceiver. So all he told me is it doesn't work. So that's all we have to go on. So as we open up the box, we find we have something called a Swan 100 MX. What is a Swan 100 MX? Here's the original bill of sales. The warranty, obviously it broke once before. It's had a repair done on it already. In 1980 it had a repair done on it. So this is probably late 70s vintage. And this is what the Swan 100 MX looks like. Isn't that a cute little radio? Looks like it's similar in size to perhaps the Atlas radios. It's all solid state, which is nice because all we need to do is come up with 12 volts DC, 12 to 14 volts DC. We can possibly use a car to power this. And it looks like I have a pretty complete package in the owner's manual. How lucky is this? A schematic? This is just as the guy packed it away in his attic 25 or more years ago. So let's look at the radio. And remember, this could just as well be an ICOM or a Yaesu or some other radio that broke and got forgotten about years ago. Okay, so this is the radio we're going to be working with to use in our emergency situation to get us in contact with the outside world. So far, all we have to go on is the ham radio operator's recollection that the radio did not transmit when put away in the box 25 years ago. You can tell this guy was somewhat of a perfectionist. This radio is so clean, you could eat off it. Don't expect the radios that you're going to find to be this nice. However, with a known problem and a record of a failure, it appears that the final transistors failed on the first failure of the radio. So we've got to find out if the finals are okay. Will it at least receive? That's important. That way we can hear what's going on in the outside world and get the transmitter working later. Also, he's got some kind of a power hookup here. That's very important. We need to come up with the 12 to 14 volts DC to power the radio. So a lot of this is going to be how to make a temporary power source for the radio that doesn't depend on AC mains. Possibly you can use a generator, solar panels, or your car as a generating system. Maybe even a windmill system to charge the batteries to power this radio. And if we can get this radio to work, this is going to give us a lifeline to the outside world. So first let's concentrate on how we're going to power this 100 watt class solid state transceiver. And of course, for emergency power, we're going to need to consider solar. We're going to look at batteries, different types of charging systems, and also you will be running off the line or off a generator at some point, so we need to look at that as well. So let's talk about emergency power with our little HF solid state transceiver. Most of these radios were made for mobile service, so they run on 12 to 14 volts. And they're 50 to 100 watt radios, meaning their PEP, peak envelope power, is higher than that. Generally, they have a way of reducing power, and that's going to help us to conserve power and battery life. These radios are useful for long-distance liaison communications, not as applicable to local communications, where you would use VHF and handy-talkie type communications, but for reaching out to other groups, and you're going to be heard, and if you want to not be discovered or not be found, this is not the radio operation that we're talking about here. This is where you actually want to reach out and contact other people. So we're going to go through the basic power requirements for the transceiver, look into the battery system, the charging system, and so on. Now, fortunately, with single sideband, the efficiency is quite good. It's only about 20% of what you would have with a key-down transmitter, like an FM transmitter or an AM transmitter. So it's pretty efficient with battery power. Also, the way that you use the radio makes a big difference. If you're only using the radio for a couple sessions each day, you're mostly receiving and transmitting very little, and you're charging the radio's battery during the day for 8 or 10 hours, you can probably maintain a schedule like that indefinitely. Some more tricks to keeping power consumption to an absolute minimum is the way that you actually operate. If you're using the receive mode, use headphones and do a lot more receiving than you are transmitting. Also, a lot of radios have a display or a backlight that can be dimmed. That's going to save power. Also, do you really need 100 watts? You might find that if you're using normal communications without interference, there shouldn't be much interference, that you can reduce your power drastically, possibly to the 5 watt key down area, which will give you about 15 watts PEP, 20 watts PEP. And of course, another important way of saving power is to have a very efficient antenna. The better your signal, the lower power you can run. And we'll have a whole section on developing an efficient antenna system for the transceiver. So typical station operation might be 20 minutes total of transmit time per day, and 100 minutes of listening, monitoring, or intercept time where you're just receiving. And then the majority of the time the radio is off, 20, 22 hours the radio is not even being used. And perhaps you have 8 to 10 hours of charge time during the day with a solar panel If you're using a generator, you probably want to have a high rate charger because you don't want to be wasting gasoline. And a rapid charger will charge the battery in short order, where with a solar charger, you have more time to charge the battery during the day. So we are the unpreppers. We have not prepared. We need to go out and find the components. We need to scavenge the components to put together the power system. The first thing we need to look for is a storage battery. The best type of battery would be a sealed marine, deep cycle, or perhaps a sealed gel cell. You're going to need to have some decent capacity, something like 40 amp hours to 100 amp hours for the battery. Most car batteries fall into that category. With unsealed batteries, and even sealed batteries, you should have some type of battery box that's insulated. And you're going to want a battery charger. There's different types of chargers. Some are manual chargers, which means you have to realize that you're rapid charging and keep your eye on the battery and then put it into trickle charge manually. Whereas a smart charger does this automatically and it won't overcharge the cells. With a solar charger, we're now able to get 75 to 100 watt type panels for, $100 to $150. It's quite reasonable. These panels are putting out 17 to 24, 25 volts, and your charge controller takes that wide range of voltage, depending on the sunlight, and converts it to a constant current or a current controlled charger to top off your 12 volt battery, and that's going to control the rate of charge into the battery. You have to be careful with some of these solar chargers because they are noisy, so we're going to handle that with some ferrite beads and try to reduce the noise. We don't want to be so noisy that we block our HF reception. So some other items you want to pick up, useful items. You will be using AC mains power sometime, or perhaps generator power. So you probably should have an AC charger, and you should have a DC to AC inverter to run small appliances and chargers, computers and so on, and other appliances. If you are running on generator power, it's good to run through a UPS, preferably a UPS that has some filtering or power conditioning. And the best types of UPSs are called dual conversion or double conversion. And they step it up to a high voltage DC, and there's a high voltage battery bank in there, and then they convert that back down to a pure sine wave AC on the output. So it's literally a dual conversion type system, and those are the best types of UPSs. The online-offline type UPSs, the older style, simply when you lose power, they go to the battery, and the battery makes the AC. Sometimes those can be found, and they'll have dead batteries, and you can take that gel cell out and sometimes recondition it and put it back in. And sometimes you can use an external battery with them. Even a small motorcycle battery will work with some of the older styles of UPSs. So I didn't want to go too crazy on the AC thing, but you will be running on generator at some point, and it's important to understand what these UPSs do. Both types will condition the power, which is very important. Surge protection and protection from EMI, RFI, because they'll have a common mode or a brute force type of filter built into them. So that's very important. Both types of UPSs are good to protect the radio, in other words, from power surges and sudden dropouts in power. And of course, you've got the battery backup. But the battery backup's almost a an afterthought. It's more the protective nature of the UPS that's important when you're running off a generator. So this may sound a little silly to some of you, but let's use an analogy to talk about the storage battery, the classic lead-acid storage battery. Think of it as a bucket that you take water out of and you put water back into. But this bucket's not perfect. It's got a hole in the bottom, a small hole, so there's always some liquid draining out, and there's some evaporation going on at the top of the pail. So you never totally get back everything that you put in. And if we use that bucket analogy, we're going to be taking a portion of the capacity in amp hours from that battery every day to do our radio net, to do our radio transmission, our receiving and our transmitting. And we need to at least replace that much back into the battery so that we can use it again the next day. There's two ways of doing it. One is by rapid charging and getting as much juice back in, well, not juice, enough water back into the bucket so that we can take more out the next day. The other is to very slowly put water into the bucket over a long period of time. That's called trickle charging. The solar panel can kind of meet in the middle. Depending on the size of the solar panel, you might be able to charge something between trickle charging and rapid charging. You probably don't have enough solar capacity to rapid charge at, say, the 10, 20, or 30 amp type rating of a charge, but you might be able to put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 amps of current throughout the day. So let's consider our 40 amp hour battery. 40 amp hour battery means that we could deliver 40 amps for an hour, or 1 amp for 40 hours. So let's say we had a receiver in our little transceiver that takes 2 amps. So every time you're in receive, doesn't matter what you're doing, you're expending 2 amps all the time. When you're transmitting, you have peaks that might be as high as 20 amps, but the average is down between 5 and 10 amps. You know, with a single sideband, you're not drawing as much. And let's say you have that schedule that we talked about, which was 2 hours a day of operation, maybe 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour at night, and that came out to 120 minutes total of operating time. 100 of that is receiving, and 20 minutes of that is actual transmitting. And the transmitter, we know that it's 10 amps, and the receiver, we know it's 2 amps. So if you multiply those numbers out, like the 100 minutes divided by 60 minutes times 2, that gives you 1.7 amp hours for running the receiver for the 100 minutes. You take the 20 minutes of operation, divide that by 60, and multiply by the 10 amps, and you get 3.4 amp hours. Add it together, you get up around 5 amp hours total you're taking out of the battery. And we know we have a hole in the bucket and we're losing power, so let's say over the day, just in loss, we lose enough that brings it up to 6 amps. So we've got to put 6 amps back into that battery, back into the bucket, in order to bring the battery up to full charge again. So 6 amps is about 15% of the 40 amp hours. So if we had a charger that could put out 6 amps, how long would it take to put 6 amp hours back into the battery? 1 hour, okay? If we have a 4 amp charger, it's going to take over an hour. It's going to take like an hour and a half. If we have a rapid charger, like a 15 amp rapid charger, it's going to take like a half an hour. And if we have a car alternator, it might only take 15 minutes to bring that battery up to full power. So that's how it works. So some of you may be saying, Mike, why are you going over some old lead-acid type charging system? Don't you know we've all moved on to lithium-ion and all kinds of polymer batteries that are quarter the size and half the weight and so on. Well, that's because we're scavenging. We have not prepared, and the flooded lead-acid battery found in your car is still the go-to emergency battery. Now, that may change in the future, but for now, the old-fashioned lead-acid battery is what we'll be using in these couple of examples. The first system is a minimal system. It's almost self-regulating. The cells are not capable of overcharging the battery, really, and so it's a small panel. It's basically trickle charging the battery all day, and you're not taking that much out of it, so that's considered a minimal system. Then we move up to the larger panels, which are, capable of 100 watts, let's say, and at that point you can charge the battery enough every day that you could do a lot more work than what we talked about, just operating the radio 2 hours a day. Perhaps you could use the radio for several hours during the day with a larger charging system like this. So again, EMI, RFI, radio frequency interference, electromagnetic interference. A lot of these devices generate noise because they're switching type power supplies. So you'll want to put ferrite beads on all of the leads close to the boxes, and I think you'll see how grounding the boxes also improves the situation for noise. So make sure that you don't have ground loops and use those ferrite beads. So luckily with this radio there was a power test cord supplied, and the nice thing about this cord, if I can get it out of the radio, is red and black, red being positive, black being negative, red and black marked on the end. This guy did a nice job marking his cable for the radio. And we're going to treat this radio like we do not have a manual and we do not have a schematic, and it's just something that we met for the first time. So with that in mind, the radio that you get your hands on probably will be missing its covers. It will have dirt and dust all over it, and you're going to need to go through and first thing and clean everything up. You want to wiggle all of the switches and then get familiarized with the front panel before you try to fire any radio up. And find out where the on-off switch is. That's very important. In the rear of this radio we also have a fuse holder, and this is a good time to check and see what we've got in there for a fuse. I'm just going to read the fuse. 250 volts, 3 amps. Now, I have a power supply that's not heavy enough to run the radio on transmit, but it goes up to 5 amps, and I can set the current limit on that power supply, and that's going to be a help in troubleshooting this radio. But for now, let's pretend we know nothing about the radio, and we just want to see if it can receive. Now, in the spirit of can the radio receive, we need to make sure that we have an external speaker hooked up, or does the radio have an internal speaker? So we look around for some holes, and sure enough, on this side there's a grill, and if I look in there I will see a speaker. So that's really a very big benefit. A lot of CBs and small solid-state ham transceivers do have a built-in speaker, and that's a big help because now we don't have to go out searching and trying to make a small computer speaker or a stereo speaker going to the radio. We're going to have to find the proper plugs and so on. But this one has a built-in speaker, so I'm feeling pretty good about trying to apply power. The first thing I'm going to do with my power supply, however, is limit the current to a couple of amps. And I will do that with a short directly across the supply, and I'll set the current to 2 amps. Okay, now I'm moving all of the switches, get them all loosened up. Remember, they haven't been touched for 25 years, so it's a good idea to turn every single control on the radio. I'm going to start on probably 80 meters, so I'll go down here at 3.5. Wiggle the RIT if it has one. 14 volts. Turn on the switch. Oh, we like to hear that. Okay, we've got some noise coming out.
I know what you mean, Chris. I'm familiar with your intimacy. Okay. That's a part of the code. So I'm actually going to go now. I'm going to ID.
That's not great, but we are picking up stations. The meter seems to be stuck.
Okay, are you coming back? Oh yeah, I am. Okay, alright,
But that's usable. Now the distortion seems to go down as I turn the volume control down. So this might just be a bad speaker. Not going to worry about that. We are able to understand, and it is working. So the next thing we want to see if we can do is use the microphone to try to transmit. And this is where we think the radio has a problem, but we don't know that yet. So if I had a CW key, this is where I would use it to see if we can get the radio to work on CW, but we would just try to get a microphone into this radio. Here's the problem. No microphone came with the radio. So now we have to figure out how to key the radio using a plug that we're stealing off an old headset, a three-way plug. It's going to have tip, ring, and it's going to have the outer sleeve. That's the ground. And we have to guess, is the tip the microphone? Okay, this is just an ordinary stereo plug stolen off an old headset. Okay, we put that in. And we're going to measure from the ground, which is this. Then we'll go to the tip. (119 ohms), and to the ring, 22.5K. So if I had to guess, I'd say the 22.5K is probably the mic input, and the tip is probably the push-to-talk. Okay, let's try to key the radio. First we're going to go from tip to sleeve. So, we know that we key the radio with tip and sleeve. So some of you are probably saying, is this microphone that I've constructed going to work with the radio, even though we know the radio has a transmit problem? First of all, let's see if the push-to-talk works. Okay, that works fine. And next, let's see if the microphone works. We're going to do that by putting it in Vox. And we're just going to talk next to the microphone. 1, 2, hello? 1, 2, hello? Hello? Okay, so we haven't even adjusted the mic gain yet, and we know that we have a microphone and a switch system that works. Now, is the microphone for the end of the world better construction than your microphone? Well, I don't know, but it is, it has rubber feet, it has a metal base that we can put weights in to give it a real heavy feel on the desk, if that's what you like. I just use this hanger as the stringer for the thing, but you might want to use a piece of tubing, like some metal candlestick approach, and run the wires through the candlestick. Notice how the microphone element has fully shielded RG174, and the push-to-talk switch a totally separate twisted pair. The grounds only meet right at the connector. So this may actually be a better microphone than you're using right now, as far as RF is concerned. N4 CPU from WU2D, Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta.
WU2D, this is November 4 Charlie Papa. November 4 Charlie Papa. Go ahead.
November 4 Charlie Papa from WU2D. Thanks for the comeback. Just testing a transceiver that I took out of the attic. This thing came out of some guy's attic. He's had it up there for 25 or more years. So at the very end I show the radio working, and you've probably got a lot of questions about that power supply that magically showed up, made out of the ATX computer power supply. More details on antennas and tuning, and also aligning the radio. taking it apart and so on. So I've decided to do a part 2, and I think you're going to enjoy part 2 because we actually get into the guts of the radio.